Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Leadership Community e-training. This year, during the ministry year, we're going to be going through a series called 7 Steps Towards Creating a Culture of Disciple Making. And last month, we looked at step 1, which was to define your destination. We said that we need to be real clear on what the destination point is, and that, according to Jesus, is to make disciples. Not decisions, but disciples. And Jesus said, if you follow me, I will make you fishers of men. So Jesus' definition of the destination that he's trying to take all of us to is to be disciples who are making other disciples. We are following Jesus, being changed by Jesus, and on mission for Jesus. In other words, disciples who are making other disciples. And we can't settle for anything less than that. We can't get stuck in, chair 2, taking existing Christians and just deepening them in their knowledge or understanding, because Jesus wants to take us to become fishers of men. And so we're not going to settle for anything less than that. Now, today, we're going to move on and say, well, if that's where Jesus is trying to take us, why are we getting stuck in some of these places, and how do we move from here to there, from where we are to where Jesus wants to take us? I want to contrast for you 2 different models. First of all, I want you to think about the cultural model of discipleship that we're currently stuck in. And then we're going to look at Jesus's New Testament model of discipleship. So let's begin with the cultural model. If I had to sum it up, I would say it's kind of a classroom, academic, mass production approach to making disciples. The idea is that if we could simply get people to listen to enough sermons, attend enough Bible studies, read enough Christian books, go to enough Christian seminars, that we could ipso facto turn them into mature Christians. But as we can readily see, that does not produce mature Christians who are fishing for the souls of men. What's the problem? Well, the problem is we've bought into an academic model, a classroom model. And Christianity is not basically a subject to be studied, it's a relationship to be nurtured. And so our model has to reflect that kind of relationship, both with God, with other people, because that's where Jesus makes disciples. Maybe I should share with you a picture that I think we've used before, but notice on your screen there, a picture of Jesus with his disciples. Jesus seems to be behind a chalkboard giving a presentation to his disciples who are sitting in chairs very much like the chairs we sat in high school. Notice the guys on the right are kind of writing notes to each other. The guy on the left is making a paper airplane. The guy in the middle is taking a little bit of a snooze. Well, that's the cultural model. But now let's think about the model that Jesus gave us in the New Testament. In other words, we should be reading the New Testament not only for what Jesus said, but also for what he did. Not just the red letter edition of Jesus' sayings, but the green letter edition for what Jesus actually did. What were his ways and means of doing ministry? Now, if I had to sum this up, I would say this is a relational model. In other words, the model moves from an academic classroom mass production model to a highly relational model. Now, you'll notice the cone diagram there, which is really based on the New Testament's understanding of how Jesus made disciples, but it also has some striking similarities to what we call social space theory. Now, social space theory is the idea that certain size groupings lend themselves to certain objectives and not to other objectives. Now, as we look at Jesus' model here, we notice, first of all, it's divided into 5 different spaces, and at the top of the cone is the public space. So we're not saying there's not a role for some kind of a more academic classroom experience. It's just that while that's essential, it's not sufficient, not by a long shot. The public space would be defined as 100 or more. Now, there are certain things that space is good for. First of all, it's good for the transmission of information. It's good for worship. So teaching and worship can take place very well in a group of 100 or more. But other things that are absolutely essential to our Christian maturity don't take place very well in that size groupings. For instance, it's very hard for people to find support or encouragement or friendship or modeling or accountability or all those things that go into making disciples. Now, you'll notice, though, that Jesus forsook a large public or even more extensive public ministry with the crowds to pour his life into a series of relationships. And those are the next three. So you might put a bracket around social, personal, and intimate, because those are the highly relational spaces that took place in Jesus's model. You'll notice on the left side it'll say Jesus and the 70. That's the social size space in groups of, say, 35 to 70, something like that. Social scientists would call them a social space gathering. Now, there are certain things that happen well there. You can be social. So if you apply this in the life of a church, let's just take our church as an example. A prime-timer group, a group of people who come together around a particular life stage, a particular affinity. In other words, they like to get together. They like to talk about the 60s and the 70s when they were growing up. They like to talk about, their grandkids. And so there's some wonderful things that can happen in a group like that, but it's too big to really begin to create transformation. But it's a good pool. It makes a good fishing pond from which we can get to know people and then pull them into the personal and intimate spaces, the Jesus in the 12, which would be the personal space, and Jesus in the 3, which would be the more intimate space. Now let's stop and think about that personal space for a while. Much of Jesus's ministry revolved around the 12. It says that Jesus went up on a mountain and he spent the whole night in prayer, and then he came down and said he chose 12, that he might be with them, and that he might send them out to preach. Now notice the end, the destination point he's got in mind. He was training them to be able to become disciples who were making other disciples. And so you can learn a lot from that. One of the things you begin to see is that it was in that kind of a grouping of about 12 people, that you can help people to get to know names, get to know needs, create a sense of community. You begin to feel like you belong. You begin to feel as though you're being supported. You're seeing modeling happen. You're seeing accountability come into play. Some of the drawbacks, though, of those groupings are, number one, they tend to be mixed groups, mixed genders. And it tends to have a diverse group of personalities, everything from dominant personalities that will, kind of dominate the conversation to more introverted types that will begin to withdraw. And so it's a little bit limited, because people in that mixed group are not going to feel comfortable talking about issues in their marriage or with their kids sometimes. They do it on occasion, but regularly people will tend to not talk about those things, and they will tend to kind of limit the level of transformation that can take place. So come down with me now to the intimate group. That's Jesus and the 3. And you'll notice as you go through the New Testament that on about 7, 8 occasions, it'll say Jesus took Peter, James, and John, and he went off to Gethsemane. He went to the Mount of Transfiguration. Some of the highlights and lowlights of Jesus's ministry were experienced with those 3, and it's probably not a coincidence that they became the most influential of the 12 apostles. Now, we know from research that the most transformative size of a group is that 3 or 4, what we call triads or quartets or micro groups. We've got a lot of those going, doing our current integrated series. But those tend to be gender specific, so it's either 3 or 4 males, 3 or 4 females, and the difference in personality does not show up as much because the sheer limited number causes higher engagement. Everybody's engaged in the conversation, and the more engaged you are, the more transformation is going to take place. Let me give you a quick formula for transformation. Transparency plus truth equals transformation. Now, if you think of that, as you go down from social to personal to intimate, those three most highly other relational spaces, the transparency goes up as you go down the cone, and the opportunity for truth, for a more in-depth study and discussion of the Bible and application of the Bible begins to take place. So it's not by accident that those micro groups will be the most transformative, because they are the best at creating transparency and truth. Now notice finally the bottom there, Jesus and the Father, that divine space is where Jesus really drew from his greatest power. You will notice this constant withdrawal of Jesus, from even those relational groups to spend time with the Father. And if you talk to people who have been in ministry a long time, you'll find out that that's the secret of their power in their ministry, is that they have learned the secret of staying closely connected to God. Now it says in Mark chapter 1 verse 35, very early in the morning while it was still dark, Jesus left the house. He went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Now you'll notice that Jesus had spaces and places in his life. Spaces like early in the morning, but I don't think it needs to be a legalistic kind of law that you have your time with Christ only in the morning. Some people don't function well in the morning. The key is that you find spaces in the course of your day, and then places. Jesus went off to a solitary place. So all of us over time begin to find places and spaces in the day where we can draw alone and be with God and just begin to talk to him about all of life. Now, a couple things that we should say here just to sum up this diagram. The key here is that we're trying to move people out of the Sunday service into a more relational setting. That's step 2. Once we know the destination where we're going, we need to realize that apart from transformative strategic relationships, people are not going to have maximum growth. You need more than a sage on the stage. You need a guide by your side. And you hear us say this all the time. You can catalyze transformation from the pulpit, from that public space, but you can only maximize it in relationships, in community. So I want you to all think about the different spaces that you're currently occupying. I'm not suggesting that you should have a foot in all 5 of the spaces, but probably have a foot in the public space where you're being exposed regularly to the teaching of God's word and to worship, to divine space where you're getting alone with God on a regular basis, and then it will change throughout different stages of life. You will have a foot in maybe 1, maybe 2 sometimes, different relational spaces. Sometimes it'll just be a social space. Other times, and probably most of the time, you would want to be in that personal space, in that intimate space. But if you're experiencing that, you're going to experience transformation, and then your ministry will be an overflow of that as you begin leveraging your relationships and encouraging people to move beyond the Sunday service and into those kinds of relationships where truth and transparency can create transformation.